Especially warm welcome to Pirjo Markkola. Professor Pirjo Markkola is a professor in history from Tampere University. And if you look at her research, you could say she has a profile characterized by breadth and also curiosity. It spans over an impressive long time period from the 18th century into the 20th century. And being a specialist on Finland, Professor Markkola has also covered the Nordic region and beyond, and including several major research topics and themes of historical research, such as social history, gender history, the Nordic welfare model, the link between religion and society, especially the importance of the Lutheran heritage, and family history and child welfare, of which Professor Markkola will speak here today. And in several of these fields, and this speaks to the curiosity, she has been a pioneer setting the agenda for future research. And in all of them, she's been a leading contributor to the fields, which is documented by a vast number of publications. Professor Markkola has also been the driving force in a number of major collaborative research projects, such as the Finnish investigation into child welfare, which we'll speak more about in a minutes, and most recently in HEX, History of Experiences, a Centre of Excellence financed by the Finnish Academy, or Finland's Academy. Professor Markkola is an internationally recognized scholar. I will not walk you through her whole career because that would take far too long, but I just want to mention that earlier this year she received one of the most prestigious awards for historian, the Rausing Prize, for her work and career. And worth to mentioning is also that Professor Markkola is, you could say, an old friend, acquaintance of SDU. She has been on several research visits here, including also a longer stay as a research visiting professor. She has been participating in several PhD committees. I saw Cecilia Pierre, who was here as one of them. And she has been participating in joint research projects with SDU researchers on several accounts. And I mean, on that note, I would say I also personally had the pleasure to work with Professor Markkola since the mid or late 1990s. I think our first encounter was when I arrived to the Nordic historical meeting in Tampere in 1997, and Pirjo had forgotten to include our session in the program. But since then, cooperation has been much more smooth. And we have a number of joint research projects, including a Nordic Centre of Excellence running from 2007 to 2014. I always learned a lot from working with Pirjo, and I'm really looking forward to learning even more here today when she's talking about how historical failures in child welfare are turning into present-day social and political issues. So Pirjo, please give the word to you now, and looking forward.
Thank you, Klaus, for this wonderful presentation, and thank you for reminding me of my failure in the 1990s. I've tried to correct it ever since. Okay, dear participants of this Zoom meeting, dear colleagues, it's a great honor for me to give this lecture today. Of course, I would rather have traveled to Odense, which is one of my favorite places in the Nordic countries, but now I try to reach you from my home office here in Tampere. Since the 1990s, an increasing number of inquiries into the history of children's out-of-home care have shown that child welfare has sometimes failed to protect children. Calls for symbolic and material compensation have intensified in all countries in which inquiries have been pursued. Today, more than 20 nations, mainly Western democracies, have conducted inquiries into the past failures of child welfare. Internationally, a common feature of these inquiries is that they are based on testimonies. They offer a safe space in which victims or survivors or caregivers can speak about their experiences. From previous studies, we know that child abuse has occurred in institutions. However, Inquiries bring the voice of former children in care to the fore. They also bring the history of child welfare into current political debates. The fact that all Nordic countries have issued testimony-driven inquiries indicates that the history of child welfare has become a public political concern. My Swedish colleague, Professor Johanna Sköld, has counted a total of 20 national or regional inquiries that were published between the 2003 and 2016 in the Nordic countries. Those inquiries address the failings of child welfare and subsequent child abuse in the 20th century. In total, some 2,400 care leaders have testified before a Nordic inquiry. How do the states deal with the legacy of historical child abuse? Various forms of redress mechanisms have been applied. Public apologies and financial redress schemes are relatively widespread, but they are not uncomplicated forms of justice. Other forms consist of peer support, memory work, memorials, and improvements in current child welfare. The Nordic countries have responded to failures of past child welfare differently, but all cases indicate that history matters in these political processes. In this presentation, my focus is on the Finnish inquiry, but I talk about it in a Nordic and transnational context. This talk is mainly based on a special issue of the Scandinavian Journal of History, which I co-edited with Johanna Sköld earlier this year and was invited by Klaus to guest edit that journal issue. Inquiries into the failures of child welfare deal with behavior and practices that sometimes break the law. However, Nordic inquiries have not resulted in legal actions against the perpetrators. They may have passed away, or their crimes are seen by a statute of limitations, or what is considered a crime today may not have been a crime at the time. Instead, the issue at stake is what responsibility current governments can take for past abusive practices. This is a question that is not only limited to child welfare. The child welfare inquiries and their restitution mechanisms are part of a wider framework. It is a question how past violence can be addressed politically. How to transform society so that victims, perpetrators, bystanders, and an unaware public can coexist while acknowledging the wrongdoings that have happened. This framework is called transitional justice. Transitional justice consists both of political practices and a growing field of academic research. As a political practice, transitional justice deals with the aftermath of wars and other conflicts, large-scale human rights violations, and authorized wrongdoings. In the field of academic studies, scholars of transitional justice have established research projects, journals, and conferences to analyze these phenomena. Originally, transitional justice consisted both of judicial mechanisms such as trials and non-judicial mechanisms such as truth commissions. The aim was to facilitate the transition from dictatorship to democracy. The Nuremberg trials or the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are probably the best known examples of transitional justice practices. However, transitional justice has also been applied to historical reparations within established democracies. In established democracies, transitional justice is related to state legitimacy and the current state's responsibility for the past. It has been argued that wrongdoing by a state burdens its legitimacy. Moreover, political legitimation depends on collective memory, which is often a matter of learning from history. This is called The Politics of Regret by historian Jeffrey Olick. He names the early 21st century as the age of compensation. The same era has been also labeled as the age of apology and the age of inquiry. Within such processes, time is politicized. The goal of transitional justice is to reform the relationship between past and present, now and then. However, this hardly happens without disputes. In these processes, democratic states negotiate what belongs to their historical present and what does not, redressing and providing compensation for the past is an urgent moral issue as well. Historical child abuse inquiries have similarities with transitional justice mechanisms, but there are also differences. For example, historical child abuse inquiries do not address specific historical events, usually. Usually, they do not focus on a certain era of rule or war or practice. Instead, they address wrongdoings that occurred over a long period of time. They cover several decades and sometimes whole centuries. Still, the history of child welfare contributes to the transitional justice framework. First, the responses to historical child abuse have the potential to address past as well as future victims, that is, children in care today and tomorrow. Many child abuse inquiries reveal an obvious link between past, present, and future at a personal and a societal level. For example, both the Finnish and Swedish inquiries report that victims experience continuous personal shame. Actually, all Nordic inquiries reveal the same. There are severe social consequences of out-of-home care in the past. Several care leavers have testified before the inquiries, not only to help themselves to cope with their own trauma, but also because they wanted to help children today. Then some words about the Finnish inquiry. The Finnish inquiry into neglect, abuse, and violence against children in institutions and foster homes was commissioned by the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health in 2013. So this is for the last. The time range was determined by the first Finnish Child Welfare Act that was in effect in 1937 to 1983. The Finnish Social Democratic Minister of Social Affairs, Maria Guzenina, referred to the Nordic experiences when she initiated the inquiry. The Swedish inquiry, in particular, formed an important point of reference. Moreover, during the preparatory phase, an independent director released a documentary film, Stolen Childhood, depicting experiences of institutional abuse. The public discussion following the release generated new public concerns and increased call for action. As a result of the preparatory work, the ministry issued fairly specific instructions on how the inquiry should be implemented in Finland. The inquiry proceeded in the form of commissioned research and included a tendering process. This procedure is an outcome of wider changes in public administration. Since the 1990s, the strong role of parliamentary committees has diminished. New public policy instruments, such as appointed rapporteurs and commissioned reports, have replaced committees, mainly replaced. In the Nordic comparison, the Danish Godhavn inquiry was also undertaken as commissioned research and conducted by a research team located at the Welfare Museum of Svenborg, as you certainly know. In Finland, the three separate aims for the inquiry were set. The first aim was to produce knowledge on the extent and nature of neglect, abuse, and violence experienced in out-of-home care. It also had to produce knowledge on the mechanisms of revealing shortcomings in child welfare. The second aim was moral. The inquiry had to underline that all forms of neglect, abuse, and violence against children are and always were unacceptable. The third aim was to learn from the past and to develop present and future child welfare. These aims were informed by the spirit of truth commissions and previous inquiries in other countries. They linked the Finnish inquiry to its international counterparts. The ministry explicitly commissioned an inquiry that would meet the academic standards. This definition afforded academic freedom and committed the inquiry to the ethical rules of academic research. The ministry appointed a steering group with academic competence to monitor and support the inquiry. Despite direct supervision by the state, the research team was not asked to suppress the results of the inquiry. Based on this experience, I argue that commissioned research may be less exposed to political pressure than committees on which various interest organizations and political parties have their representatives. However, the academic freedom of commissioned research depends very much on the mandate given to the research team. It also depends on the self-understanding of the state administrative body commissioning the report. In line with other Nordic inquiries, the Finnish inquiry shared an explicit commitment to listen to the testimonies. Following the tradition of truth commissions, the researchers were not expected to disbelieve or doubt the authenticity of narrated experiences. The interviewees themselves determined whether their experiences fulfilled the criteria of violence, abuse, and neglect. All interviews are anonymous. The strict anonymization policy was demanded by the university and by the ministry. For some informants, the promise of total anonymity was a precondition for giving an interview. Some others were willing to give their full name and the names of abusers. For them, anonymity meant continuation of secrecy and hiding past injustice. In Denmark, the project called In Care in History interviewed previously institutionalized people and allowed the informants to decide whether their interviews were anonymized or not. That was not possible in the Finnish case. In the analysis of these interviews, memories of out-home care were read as adults' interpretations of their own childhood, produced in a dialogue between interviewer and interviewee. The data was primarily analyzed as the experienced truth of the interviewees. The oral history approach advanced the moral objective to listen to the interviewees' stories and offer them an opportunity to recount their experiences. The particularly large number of testimonies referring to similar experiences reveals patterns and practices that made violence and abuse possible in the past. In order to produce contextual knowledge of past wrongdoings, the oral history approach was complemented with historical document analysis. The inquiry turned to committee reports, correspondence, and other material related to the implementation of the Child Welfare Act. These explorations, among other things, revealed some ways in which central administration and local authorities struggled with the inadequacies of out-of-home care. One problem with inquiries is that they tend to project present values onto the past. We tried to avoid it. For example, we distinguished between authorized corporal punishment and unauthorized corporal punishment. This served to reveal the cases where corporal punishment was excessive by the standards of the time. However, contextualization can't overlook past wrongs, but it helps to reveal mechanisms that make such injustice possible. A fair contextualization helps to see the scale and the speed of experiences. The Finnish Inquiry found discrepancies between the normative level and the practical level of local social welfare boards and offices. All too often, good intentions did not translate into good practices. The state issued several recommendations and instructions to improve the level of child welfare in both municipalities and child welfare institutions. However, local resources were so sparse, all the view of local authorities so firmly established that these recommendations fell on deaf ears. This could be one of the explanations for the continuation of violence and abusive practices. Moreover, more structural or systemic failures were also possible. In 2016, the Finnish Inquiry led to an apology ceremony in the International Children's Day. Minister of Family Affairs and Social Services, Mr. Juha Rehula, officially made an apology on behalf of the Republic of Finland to those who had been victims of ill treatment in child welfare. Claims for financial redress, however, were not addressed in the official apology, and no compensation schemes were introduced after the inquiry. What distinguishes the Nordic context of redress processes from international processes? There are some specific Nordic features. First, failures of child welfare are associated with the dark side of the welfare state. In many countries, the absence of a strong welfare state appears to be the problem. In nations where Catholic Church and other faith-based organizations have largely administered children's institutions, the problem is rather that the state has trusted in the church. The discourse of the dark side of the Nordic welfare state emerged in the 1990s as a response to interventionist social policies. In Sweden, for example, it first tackled the forced sterilizations. This led to an inquiry and a state-financed redress scheme. That scheme was crucial for the following redress process aimed at the victims of historical child abuse. Another aspect that distinguishes the Nordic responses internationally is the wide spectrum of neglect, abuse, and violence against children. Internationally, several inquiries and redress packages have focused on child sexual abuse, whereas other forms of violence are not included. Sexual abuse has been one category of abuse in all Nordic inquiries, but no inquiry focuses solely on sexual abuse. In spite of some joint Nordic features, there are also differences. In Norway, Iceland, Denmark, and Åland in Finland, the focus has been on institutions. In Sweden and Finland mainland, and the rest of Finland, inquiries covered all forms of out-of-home care, including foster care. Internationally, only one Scottish inquiry and one Dutch inquiry have, as far as I know, have had an explicit remit to tackle foster care, whilst most inquiries focus on institutional abuse. The Swedish and Finnish inquiries, however, suggest that foster homes may have been even more abusive than institutions. We hope that the Swedish and Finnish examples would motivate other national inquiries to take a closer look at foster care as well. As a result of inquiries, most Nordic parliaments or governments have been relatively willing to apologize to victims. In Denmark, however, an official apology and other forms of state redress were denied for a long time. It was argued that the present society can't take responsibility for past treatment or notions of children that were different from current ideas. It was a problem of retroactivity. However, as you certainly remember, this changed last year. After 15 years of political and activist struggle, in August 2019, the then newly appointed Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen offered a public apology to the victims. Based on comparative reading of Danish and Swedish argumentation, historian Malin Arvidsson argues that a retroactivity dilemma is an issue that any redress process will face. These processes can strengthen the idea that past injustices have consequences for contemporary societies. However, they can also position those injustices firmly in the past. Uses of history and the ways in which history matters in current politics have been given different interpretations by the Nordic decision makers, and they have been also changing interpretations. In the cases of Norway, Iceland, and Sweden, financial redress schemes have been established. Such schemes also enact the retroactivity dilemma and the uses of history in new ways. In Sweden, for example, the design and practical implementation of the redress scheme relied on legal expertise. The victim's understanding of abuse, as well as the historian's understanding of abuse, were made secondary. Legal experts relied on their own assumptions about history. They defined which abusive practices in the past were eligible for compensation in the present. And as a result, in Sweden, only 46% of claimants were compensated, less than half. This figure is in stark contrast with the outcome of the Icelandic redress scheme, under which 97% of claimants received compensation. The formal context of inquiries also vary in the Nordic countries. While inquiries in Sweden, Iceland, and Norway were conducted by state officials working in either regional or national government commissions, the Danish inquiry was awarded to a museum and the Finnish inquiry to a university. There are both benefits and pitfalls of conducting commissioned research. A commissioned academic project can be strong in its political neutrality, in particular among the informants, and also in its knowledge production, but its impact on political decision-making can remain marginal. Nevertheless, at least in Finland, the contract between the ministry and the inquiry team made it clear that the inquiry was to rely on historical knowledge production. It underlined that narratives of past experiences were to be used to improve future practices of child welfare. The link between past, present, and future practices was strikingly direct. Moreover, Nordic inquiries and redress schemes suggest that the distance in time is a political issue. This is evident in the case of Denmark with a law reform in 2018. In child abuse cases, statutes of limitations were cancelled retroactively in Denmark. Theoretically, this change emphasizes continuity between past, present, and future. Past abuse and violence are matters belonging to the present. The Swedish redress scheme, for its part, was based on a temporary law. It constructed abuse and violence as something belonging to the past. After the temporary law, no claims were possible to be made in Sweden. Distance in time is thus given differing meanings. Testimony-driven inquiries also remind that not only memories, but also care levers with all their past experiences are present in our society. So this, at least as long as there are people with their memories and experiences, these events are present in present society. Thank you. I think I'll